Sometimes life doesn't fall apart all at once. It crumbles slowly until one day you're standing in the wreckage, wondering how you got there. Gunnar Veland knew that feeling well. At 58, divorced and alone after his charter business failed, he set sail along Norway's remote northern coast, hoping the sea would help him find his way again. Instead, a violent storm threw his boat against the rocks of an uninhabited Arctic island. Injured and freezing, Gunnar found shelter in an old stone hut that shouldn't have been there. Inside, beneath the floorboards, he discovered $10 million in Cold War bearer bonds marked with Soviet seals and a dead man's name. No phone signal, no rescue coming, and footprints in the snow that weren't his own. What would you do if survival meant choosing between a fortune and your life? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, subscribe, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months before the storm that would change everything, Gunnar Veland stood in the empty office of what had once been his thriving charter boat business in Tromsø, Norway. The walls still bore the faded outlines of framed photographs, 20 years of happy tourists, successful fishing expeditions, and sunset cruises along the Arctic coastline. Now there was nothing but dust and silence. The divorce papers sat in his leather satchel, signed and finalized 2 weeks prior. 25 years of marriage to Ingrid, dissolved in a courtroom in less than an hour. No dramatic arguments, no final confrontation, just two people who had slowly become strangers, agreeing that whatever they'd once had was gone. Their daughter Astrid, 26 now and working abroad in London, had stopped returning his calls after the separation. He couldn't blame her. What do you say to your father when he's let everything fall apart? Gunnar ran his weathered hand along the desk where he'd planned. Countless voyages. At 58, he looked older than his years. Grey threaded through his dark blonde hair, and deep lines creased his face from decades of squinting against the northern sun. His hands, strong and calloused from years of working ropes and nets, trembled slightly as he locked the office door for the last time. The business had failed not from lack of skill, but from the weight of accumulated debt and poor decisions. He'd expanded too quickly, bought a second boat he couldn't afford, and when tourism declined during the economic downturn, everything collapsed like a house of cards. The bank had been patient, then insistent, then final. The boats were sold at auction, the office lease terminated, everything he'd built over 2 decades gone. His best friend Bjorn Halvorsen had tried to warn him years ago. Bjorn, 62, and built like the fisherman he'd been for 40 years, had urged caution when Gunnar proposed the expansion. "The sea provides, but she's not a bank," Bjorn had said over coffee one morning. "Don't borrow against tomorrow's catch." But Gunnar hadn't listened. He'd been so certain, so confident, that his knowledge of these waters and his reputation would carry him through any storm. Now, standing on the harbour dock, watching the sunset paint the Arctic waters in shades of gold and crimson, Gunnar felt the full weight of his failures. The apartment he'd moved into after the divorce was small and cold. Ingrid had kept the house their house, the one they'd raised Astrid in. Fair enough. She'd earned it, putting up with his long absences, his obsession with the business, his slow, emotional retreat over the years. In his pocket, his father's old brass compass felt heavy. His father, deceased for 10 years now, had given it to him when Gunnar was 16. "When you're lost at sea," his father had said, "this will always point you home. But remember, it can only show direction. You have to choose to follow it." His father had been a practical man, a naval officer who'd served during the Cold War years, monitoring Soviet activity along Norway's northern border. He'd taught Gunnar everything about these waters, about reading weather, about respecting the Arctic's power. What would his father think of him now? Divorced, broke, adrift, at an age when most men were planning retirement. Bjorn found him there as twilight deepened. The older man carried 2 bottles of beer and wore his perpetual expression of concerned skepticism. "You're brooding again," Bjorn said, handing over a bottle. "That's never helped anything." "Just thinking," Gunnar replied. "About?" "Taking the Times Nord's journey times out. One last voyage up the coast. Clear my head before." He paused. Before what? He didn't know. The Times Nordstjerne Times North Star was his last possession, a small but sturdy 30-foot sailboat he'd managed to keep by claiming it as personal property rather than business asset. She was old, needed maintenance, but she was seaworthy. More importantly, she was his. Bjorn studied him with the careful attention of someone who'd known him for 40 years. They'd grown up together in Tromsø, fished these waters as teenagers, served in the Coastal Guard together. Bjorn knew Gunnar's moods better than Gunnar knew them himself. "How long?" Bjorn asked. "Few weeks, maybe a month. Just want to sail, think, figure out what comes next." "Alone?" "Alone, alone." Bjorn frowned, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening. "The northern coast this time of year, storms come up fast. You know that better than anyone." "I'll be careful. Stay close to shore. Check weather constantly." "I'm not planning to die out there, Bjorn. I'm planning to remember why I loved this in the first place." They drank in silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. The midnight sun season had passed, and now darkness was returning to the Arctic, creeping back a little more each day. Soon it would be polar night, when the sun barely rose above the horizon. "When do you leave?" Bjorn finally asked. 3 days. Soon as I provision the boat. Call me. Every day. I don't care if you think you're bothering me. Every day, Gunnar. I will. But they both knew he probably wouldn't. Gunnar had always been someone who needed solitude to process things, to work through problems in his own head. The sea had always been his therapist, his confessor, his clarity. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Gunnar stocked the Times, Nordstjerne Times, with supplies, canned goods, dried fish, fresh water, fuel for the small engine he'd use when wind failed. He checked the rigging, tested the radio, plotted a rough course that would take him along the remote northern coastline, past islands that rarely saw visitors, through waters he'd navigated 100 times before. Astrid called the night before he left. It was the first time they'd spoken in 6 weeks. "Dad?" Her voice was tentative, careful. "Astrid, it's good to hear from you. Bjorn called me, said you're going sailing alone." "Of course," Bjorn had called her, meddling old friend. "Just need some time to think," Gunnar said. "About what?" "Everything," he wanted to say. "About how I failed your mother, failed the business, failed at being the father you deserved." Instead, he said, "Just need to clear my head. Figure out next steps. You could come to London. Stay with me for a bit. We could talk." The offer surprised him. You'd want that? You're still my father." A pause. "Even if things have been difficult." Difficult. That was one word for it. "After I get back," he said. "After this trip, maybe I'll take you up on that." "Promise?" "Promise." They talked for a few more minutes, awkward but genuine, before saying goodbye. Gunnar held the phone long after she'd hung up, feeling something close to hope for the first time in months. He left Tromsø harbour at dawn, with Bjorn standing on the dock watching him go. The older man raised, one hand in farewell, and Gunnar returned the gesture. The Times, Nord's journey Times, cut through the calm harbour waters, her engine purring softly, and then he raised the sails and let the wind take him north. The first week was exactly what he'd needed. The rhythm of sailing, the constant small adjustments, the watchfulness required by these waters, it all settled his mind. He anchored in small coves at night, cooked simple meals, and slept to the sound of water against the hull. The coastline here was dramatic, steep cliffs, narrow fjords, small islands that appeared suddenly in the mist. He passed fishing boats occasionally, exchanged waves with their crews. He saw seals and seabirds, once a pod of orcas that surfaced near his bow, their massive dorsal fins cutting through the water like black knives. The beauty of it reminded him why he'd fallen in love with this life in the first place, but by the second week, restlessness crept back in. Where was he actually going? What was this trip solving? He still had no plan for his future, no income, no purpose. The sea was beautiful, but it offered no answers. He deviated from his planned route on day 12, heading farther north than he'd intended, toward more remote waters. He told himself it was just exploration, just extending the voyage a bit. He didn't call Bjorn that day or the next. On day 14, the weather forecast began warning of a major storm system developing to the northwest. Gunnar knew he should turn back, head for shelter in one of the larger settlements. But something stubborn in him resisted. He'd weathered storms before. The Times, Nord's journey Times, was solid. He'd be fine. His father's compass sat in its usual place near the helm, the brass catching the grey afternoon light. It still pointed true north, steady and reliable. But Gunnar wasn't following it anymore. He was following something else, some need to push further, to test himself, to prove he wasn't finished yet. The storm caught him 30. Hours later, 50 miles from the nearest port, in waters that rarely saw traffic. And when it hit with a fury that made his previous confidence seem like pure foolishness. The first sign was the wind shift. Gunnar had been watching the clouds build on the northwestern horizon for the past hour, dark and heavy, moving faster than they should. The barometer had been dropping steadily, and now the wind veered suddenly from northwest to north-northeast, gusting hard enough to heel the Times, Nord's journey Times, sharply to port. He'd waited too long. He knew it the moment the first raindrops hit his face, cold and hard as pebbles. Gunnar scrambled to reef the mainsail, fighting the wind that tried to tear the canvas from his hands. The waves were building rapidly, transforming from orderly swells into chaotic mountains of grey water. Within 20 minutes, the storm was fully upon him, and he realized, with a sickening clarity, that this was unlike anything he'd experienced in 40 years of sailing these waters. The rain became sleet, then snow, driven horizontally by winds that screamed through the rigging. Visibility dropped to nearly zero. The Times, Nord's journey Times, climbed each wave like a struggling animal, hung suspended at the crest, then plunged down the far side into troughs so deep that the sky disappeared. Water poured over the bow with each descent, flooding the cockpit faster than the scuppers could drain it. Gunnar clipped his safety harness to the jackline and fought his way forward to take down the remaining sail. His hands, even in thick gloves, were already numb. The cold was brutal, penetrating, the kind of Arctic cold that could kill in minutes if you went into the water. He wrestled the sail down and lashed it tight, then worked his way back to the helm. The engine. He needed the engine to maintain steering. His half-frozen fingers fumbled with the ignition. The diesel coughed, sputtered, caught. The steady throb beneath his feet was reassuring for exactly 3 minutes before a rogue wave hit them broadside, rolling the boat so far over that Gunnar was certain they'd capsize. Water cascaded over the gunwale. Something below decks crashed and shattered. When the Times Nordstjerne Times righted herself, the engine was dead, flooded, probably. No time to investigate. He was now at the storm's mercy, helpless except for the small sea anchor he deployed to keep the bow pointed into the waves. Hours blurred together. Gunnar had no sense of time, only the endless cycle of waves and the burning in his muscles as he worked the helm, trying to keep them from broaching. His shoulder, an old injury from his coastal guard days, began to ache, then scream with pain. Still he held on. Through the darkness and snow, he caught glimpses of something, a darker mass against the dark water. Land, rocky outcrops. The storm was driving him toward the coast, toward one of the countless small islands that dotted this region. Under normal circumstances, he could have avoided it easily. Now he had no choice. The rocks appeared suddenly, black and jagged, waves exploding against them in massive white fountains. Gunnar tried to steer away, but the current and wind were too strong. The Times Nordstjerne Times was dragged inexorably toward the shore. "No, no, no," he shouted into the wind, though no one could hear him. The impact, when it came, was catastrophic. The keel struck stone with a grinding crunch that Gunnar felt through his entire body. The mast whipped forward, then snapped with a crack like a gunshot. Rigging fell across the deck in a tangle of cables and canvas. A second wave lifted the boat and threw it again, harder this time. The hull split with a tearing sound. Water poured in. Gunnar had perhaps 60 seconds. He grabbed his emergency pack from its storage locker, waterproof, always kept ready, and his duffel bag with his personal items. The cold water was already around his knees. The boat was going down. He climbed over the side and jumped, hitting the water between the boat and rocks. The shock of the Arctic water was like being stabbed with 1,000 knives. His body locked up, muscles seizing. For a terrifying moment he couldn't move, couldn't breathe, could only feel the killing cold. Then training and survival instinct kicked in. He forced himself to swim, to kick, to get away from the boat before the next wave smashed it and him against the rocks. His pack and duffel dragged at him, but he held on. 3 strokes. 5. 10. His hand touched stone, scraped it, found purchase. He hauled himself onto a flat rock just as another wave hit, nearly washing him back into the sea. Crawling, shaking violently from cold and shock, Gunnar dragged himself higher onto the rocky shore. Behind him, the Times Nordstjerne Times was breaking apart, disappearing piece by piece into the violent surf. 20 meters up from the water's edge, he collapsed, gasping, his body convulsing with hypothermia. He couldn't stay here. If he stayed, he would die. The wind cut through his soaked clothing as if he were naked. Already his fingers and toes were going numb, his core temperature dropping. He had minutes, not hours. With shaking hands, Gunnar pulled out his emergency radio. Water dripped from it. He pressed the power button. Nothing. He tried again. Dead. The waterproof seal must have failed in the impact. No radio, no boat. No one knew exactly where he was. He deviated from his planned route and hadn't reported his position in 3 days. The realization of his complete isolation settled over him like the falling snow. Move. He had to move, find shelter, get warm. Everything else was secondary. Gunnar forced himself to his feet. The island, he could barely see it through the snow, and darkness appeared small, rocky, uninhabited. Hills of stone rose to his left. To his right, the coastline curved away into the storm. He picked a direction and started walking, stumbling, barely able to feel his legs. His father's compass was still in his jacket pocket. When he pulled it out with trembling fingers, he saw the glass had cracked, but the needle still moved. North. He was on the island's southern shore. If there was any shelter, any break from the wind, it would be on the northern side, in the lee. He walked for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Twice he fell. The second time, he lay there for a full minute, considering just staying down, letting the cold take him. It would be easy, peaceful, they said. Just go to sleep. But he thought of Astrid, of their awkward phone conversation, of his promise to visit her in London. He thought of Bjorn, who would blame himself for not stopping Gunnar from leaving. He thought of his father, who had survived 3 decades of Arctic deployments and wouldn't have quit. Gunnar got up. The hut appeared like a miracle, though he almost missed it. It was built into a rocky outcrop, its stone walls blending with the natural formation. Only the dark rectangle of the door, slightly ajar, gave it away. He stumbled toward it, fell against the door, and it swung inward. The interior was warmer than outside, not warm, but warmer. Out of the wind, that alone might save his life. Gunnar crawled inside and pushed the door closed behind him. Darkness enveloped him. He lay on the wooden floor, shaking so violently his teeth rattled. Slowly, as his eyes adjusted, he could make out shapes. A wood stove in the corner, a table, shelves. His numb fingers found his waterproof flashlight, clicked it on. The beam revealed a space that shouldn't exist. The hut was furnished, maintained. Canned goods lined the shelves, though the labels were faded and old. Blankets were folded on a narrow bed. Most impossibly, when he touched the wood stove, it was still warm. The ashes inside were fresh. Someone had been here, recently. But Gunnar's immediate need overrode his confusion. Firewood was stacked neatly beside the stove. With shaking hands, barely able to grip anything, he built a fire. The matches in his emergency pack were dry. The kindling caught, then the larger pieces. Warmth began to spread. He stripped off his wet clothes, wrapped himself in the blankets, and huddled beside the growing fire. His body, slowly, agonizingly, began to warm. The shaking subsided. Sensation returned to his extremities, painful, burning sensation that made him gasp. He'd survived. Against impossible odds, he'd survived. But as warmth returned and his mind began to function again, questions arose. Where was he? Whose hut was this? And why, in the middle of an uninhabited Arctic island, did it look like someone had just stepped out for a walk? Outside, the storm continued to rage. Gunnar fed more wood to the fire and tried not to think about the footprints he'd seen in the snow near the door. Fresh prints, larger than his own, leading away into the darkness. Gunnar woke to silence. The storm had passed, leaving. Behind an eerie stillness broken only by the occasional drip of melting ice from the hut's eaves, grey morning light filtered through a small window, illuminating dust motes suspended in the cold air. He sat up slowly, his body a catalogue of aches and pains. His shoulder throbbed where he'd injured it during the crash. His hands were raw, several fingernails blackened from impact trauma. But he was alive, dry, and relatively warm. The fire had burned down to coals during the night. Standing, wrapped in one of the blankets, Gunnar took his first proper look at the hut. It was roughly 15 feet square, built with surprising craftsmanship. The stone walls were thick, chinked with some kind of mortar that had held for decades. A single window faced east. The door was solid wood, weathered but intact. Someone had built this place to last. The shelves held an odd collection of supplies. Canned goods, mostly sardines, beans, condensed milk with labels in Norwegian, but dating from the 1980 seconds and early 1990 seconds. A few bottles of aquavit, unopened. Candles, a kerosene lamp with fuel, matches in a waterproof tin, basic cooking implements hung from hooks on the wall. More interesting were the personal items: a straight razor and shaving mug, a thick wool sweater, too small for Gunnar, reading glasses, and books, a shelf of them, mostly in Russian, with a few in Norwegian, technical manuals, novels, a well-worn copy of Dostoevsky. This wasn't an emergency shelter. Someone had lived here, at least temporarily. The question was, when and why? Gunnar added wood to the fire and set about exploring more thoroughly. In a wooden crate beneath the bed, he found additional blankets, a medical kit with ancient but possibly still useful supplies, and a fishing rod with tackle. Whoever had stocked this place had planned for extended isolation. It was when he moved the crate back into position that he noticed the floorboard. One board, near the corner by the wood stove, sat slightly higher than the others. The wood grain didn't quite match. Curious, Gunnar knelt and worked his fingers around the edge. The board lifted easily, revealing a shallow space beneath. Inside was a leather satchel, cracked with age but still intact. His heart began to pound as he pulled it out. The leather was quality, probably expensive when new. Embossed on the front, faded but visible, were two initials, P.K. Gunnar carried the satchel to the table and opened it with careful hands. What he found inside made him sit down heavily on the wooden chair. Bearer bonds, stacks of them, each certificate elaborately printed with Cyrillic text and official-looking seals. Gunnar's Russian was limited to basic phrases learned during his naval service, but he could make out enough. Soviet State Bank, various denominations, and dates all from 1989 and 1990, the final years before the Soviet Union collapsed. He counted them carefully. The denominations varied, but his rough calculation, converting the old Soviet values and accounting for historical exchange rates he vaguely remembered, suggested these bonds were worth millions. Possibly 10 million or more, depending on whether they were still valid, whether they could be redeemed. His hands trembled as he set them down. This was impossible. Why would someone hide Soviet bearer bonds on an uninhabited Norwegian island? And who was P.K.? Beneath the bonds, wrapped in oilcloth, was a notebook. The cover was plain, the pages filled with handwriting in Russian. Gunnar opened it carefully, handling the brittle pages with care. Dates marked many entries, the first from March 1988, the last from May 1991. A journal, P.K.'s journal. Gunnar flipped through the pages, frustrated by his inability to read more than a few words. But he could make out certain things. Sketches, detailed drawings of this island, the hut, what looked like compass bearings and coordinates, maps showing routes through Norwegian fjords, and on several pages, one word repeated, Semja, family. His father had taught him that word during Gunnar's brief interest in learning Russian as a teenager. Family. Whatever P.K. had been doing here, family was central to it. Near the back of the journal, tucked between pages, Gunnar found a photograph. The image was faded but clear enough, a man in his 40s with dark hair and serious eyes, standing with a woman and a young boy. The woman was elegant, with a gentle smile. The boy, maybe 8 or 9, grinned at the camera with the unself-conscious joy of childhood. On the back, in Cyrillic script, Semja превыше всего 1989. Family above all. Gunnar stared at the faces for a long time. PK and his family. The bonds weren't theft, then. Or if they were theft motivated by love, by the desperate need to protect these people. His own failures felt suddenly small in comparison. He'd lost a business, a marriage. But he'd never had to flee his country, hide money in a frozen wilderness, risk everything for the people he loved. Whatever PK's story was, it had been far more desperate than Gunnar's own. The sound of something outside broke his concentration, a scraping sound, like boots on stone. Gunnar's pulse quickened. He moved to the window and looked out carefully. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, a thin layer covering everything. And in that snow, clearly visible, were footprints. Not his own, these were larger, deeper, the tracks of someone heavier moving with purpose. They led from the rocky outcrop beyond the hut, approached the door, then circled around to the window where Gunnar now stood, then led away toward the island's northern shore. Someone had been here while he slept. Had looked in the window, perhaps, had seen him unconscious by the fire, and had chosen not to come inside. Gunnar's mouth went dry. He wasn't alone on this island. He quickly returned everything to the satchel and hid it back beneath the floorboard. Then he took stock of his situation with a clearer head. His emergency pack contained basic supplies: a knife, waterproof matches, emergency blanket, first aid kit, energy bars, water purification tablets. His duffel bag held changes of clothes, his father's compass, some personal items. Not much, but enough to survive for a while if he was careful. The hut's supplies would extend that considerably. He had shelter, fuel for fire, food for perhaps 2 weeks if he rationed carefully. Water could be melted from snow. The question was rescue. How long until someone came looking for him? Bjorn would raise the alarm when Gunnar missed their next check-in, which should have been 2 days ago. But Gunnar had deviated from his filed route. Search and rescue would look in the wrong areas first. He needed to signal for help. The highest point of the island would offer the best visibility. If he could build a fire there, create smoke, any passing vessel or aircraft might spot it. Gunnar, dressed in his warmest clothes, layered the too small sweater from the hut over his own, and prepared to venture outside. He took the knife from his emergency pack and one of the bottles of aquavit, not to drink, but because alcohol burned hot and bright. The door opened with a creak. Outside, the Arctic landscape was breathtaking in its harsh beauty. The island was perhaps 2 kilometers long and half that wide, mostly bare rock and patches of hardy vegetation. To the south, he could see the coastline, where the Times Nordstjern Times had wrecked. Pieces of his boat were scattered across the rocks, the hull, a broken shell, already being reclaimed by the sea. Gunnar followed the footprints, curiosity overriding caution. They led across the island's center, past clusters of wind-carved stone, through patches of snow and exposed rock. The person who made them knew where they were going, moving confidently, even in the aftermath of the storm. The tracks ended at the northern shore, at a small rocky beach. And there, pulled up above the tide line and covered with a camouflage tarp, was a small motorboat. Modern, well-maintained, with Norwegian registration numbers on the bow. Someone was definitely on this island. Someone who had come here deliberately, with supplies and equipment. Someone who knew about the hut, probably knew about PK's hidden bonds. And now they knew about Gunnar. Gunnar stood on the northern beach, staring at the motorboat, his mind racing through possibilities. Whoever owned this vessel had the means to leave the island whenever they chose. They had a working engine, fuel, communication equipment, probably. Yet they'd left him alone in the hut, hadn't announced themselves, hadn't offered help. That suggested either caution or something darker. He considered taking the boat, simply starting it and heading for the mainland, getting to safety, reporting his situation to authorities. But that would be theft, and more importantly, it would be stupid. He didn't know these waters well enough to navigate without charts, and the boat's owner might return at any moment. A confrontation in these conditions, isolated and injured, wasn't something Gunnar wanted. Instead, he memorized the registration numbers and carefully replaced the tarp exactly as he'd found it. Then he followed a different route back to the hut, one that would allow him to see if anyone was following. No one was. The island remained silent, except for the wind and the distant crash of waves. Back inside the hut, Gunnar retrieved PK's journal and spread it on the table. He needed to understand what he'd stumbled into. Using the few Russian-Norwegian dictionaries he found among the books, along with his limited knowledge of the language, he began the painstaking work of translation. It took hours. His shoulder ached, his head throbbed, but he persisted. Slowly, a story emerged from the fragmentary translations. Pyotr Konstantin PK had been some kind of Soviet operative, stationed in the region during the late 1982. The journal's early entries were sparse, mostly practical notes about weather, supplies, and coordinates. But as 1989 progressed, the tone shifted. Personal reflections appeared, doubts, fears. One entry from October 1989 partially translated, "The system is crumbling. Everyone can see it now, even those who refuse to speak the truth." What future for Mikhail in a country that devours its own people? Anna deserves better than this fear, this constant looking over shoulders. Anna, the woman in the photograph. Mikhail, the boy. Later entries became more urgent. PK described acquiring the bearer bonds. Gunnar's limited Russian couldn't capture exactly how, but the word redirected appeared several times, along with what might have been operational funds. PK had stolen money meant for espionage operations, converting it to bearer bonds that could be cashed anywhere by anyone who possessed them. An entry from March 1990. The bonds are secure. 12 million American dollars when converted. Enough for 3 lifetimes. Enough for Anna to never worry again. For Mikhail to attend any university. To be free. This island, this hut, my insurance. When the time comes, I will bring them here. Wait for the contact. Cross to Canada. A new life. The bonds buy that life. But something had gone wrong. The later entries became fragmented, paranoid, references to watchers and exposure. An entry from January 1991. They suspect. How? Who talked? Must move carefully now. Anna and Mikhail cannot know the danger. Better they think I am delayed, working, than terrified. The final entry, dated the 3rd of May 1991, was brief. Tomorrow. Will reach them tomorrow. If this journal is found, and I have not returned, know that I tried. Family above all. Gunnar sat back, the weight of 34 years pressing down on him. PK had never returned, never retrieved the bonds, never brought his family to safety. Something had stopped him, and Gunnar could imagine what. The Soviet system, even in its death throes, didn't look kindly on defectors who stole millions. The photograph seemed to stare at him from the table. Anna and Mikhail, frozen in that moment of 1989, not knowing what the future held. Were they still alive? Had they ever learned what happened to Pyotr? Or had they simply lived with his disappearance, another mystery in a time of chaos? Gunnar's contemplation was interrupted by a sound, the distinct rumble of a boat engine, approaching from the north. He moved quickly to the window. The motorboat was leaving, cutting across the choppy water toward the mainland. He could see a figure at the helm, too distant to make out details, but clearly a man, bundled against the cold. So his mysterious watcher was leaving. The question was for how long, and whether he'd be back. Gunnar used the opportunity to explore the island more thoroughly. The highest point was a rocky hill in the island's center, perhaps 50 meters above sea level. From there, he could see in all directions. To the south, the remnants of his boat. To the north, empty water stretching to the horizon. East and west, more small islands dotted the seascape, all apparently uninhabited. He spent the afternoon gathering driftwood and debris from his wrecked boat, hauling it to the hilltop. If a ship or aircraft passed, he could light a signal fire. He arranged stones to spell out "help" in letters 3 meters tall, visible from the air. Back at the hut, he made a more thorough inventory. The canned goods were old, but most appeared intact, no bulging, no rust compromising the seals. He tried a can of sardines, found them edible if not delicious. The aquavit was smooth and warming. He allowed himself one small drink, feeling the alcohol spread heat through his chest. As evening approached, Gunnar faced a decision about the bonds. They represented a fortune, assuming they were still valid. Bearer bonds were exactly what the name suggested. Whoever bore them, possessed them, owned them. No names, no registration, no trail. Just like cash, but in much larger denominations, the moral questions were complex. P.K. had stolen them, technically, but he'd stolen them from a government that no longer existed for the sake of his family's survival. That family, if Gunnar's interpretation was correct, had never received the money. So who did it belong to now? Legally, probably the Russian government as the successor state to the Soviet Union. Practically, whoever found them. And morally, Gunnar wasn't sure. His own desperate circumstances made the temptation almost overwhelming. $10 million. Enough to pay every debt, restart his business, secure his future, maybe even repair his relationship with Astrid by proving he wasn't a complete failure. One decision, one choice to pocket the bonds and say nothing, and all his problems could evaporate. But he'd been raised better than that. His father had been unbending on questions of honor and integrity. A man's word and his character are all he truly owns, his father used to say. Everything else can be taken away. Gunnar made a decision. He would document everything, the bonds, the journal, the photograph. He would take detailed notes and photographs with his waterproof camera. When rescue came, he would report what he'd found to the proper authorities. Let them decide the legal questions. He would do the right thing, even if it cost him his one chance at financial salvation. The decision made, he felt oddly lighter, freed, somehow, from the weight of temptation. That night, with the fire burning low and the Arctic darkness complete outside, Gunnar lay wrapped in blankets and thought about PK. They were separated by decades and vastly different circumstances, but Gunnar felt a strange kinship with this man he'd never met. Both of them had reached a point of desperation. Both had been trying to protect something PK, his family's future, Gunnar perhaps his own sense of self-worth. The difference was that PK had been willing to risk everything, to break every rule, for love. What had Gunnar ever risked? He'd played it safe, followed the conventional path, and still ended up here alone, broke, divorced, sleeping in a dead man's shelter. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through cracks in the stone walls. Gunnar pulled the blankets tighter and closed his eyes. Tomorrow he would work on signaling for rescue, on finding a way off this island. Tonight he would sleep and try not to think about the fortune hidden beneath the floorboards, or the man whose desperate gamble had left it there, unclaimed and forgotten for 3 decades. Somewhere in the darkness, he thought he heard a boat engine again, distant and uncertain. But when he went to the window, he saw nothing but darkness and falling snow. The 4th morning on the island brought a discovery that changed everything. Gunnar woke early, restless from dreams of drowning and distant voices. He added wood to the fire and stepped outside to check his signal arrangements on the hilltop. The stones spelling "help" had been disturbed. Not by wind or weather, the arrangement was too deliberate. Someone had rearranged them to spell "wait" instead. Gunnar's heart hammered in his chest. The message was clear. Someone knew he was here, knew about the bonds, presumably, and wanted him to stay put. But wait for what? Rescue? Or something else? He scanned the island's rocky landscape, but saw no one. The motorboat was still gone from the northern beach he'd checked earlier. Yet someone had been here during the night, moving close enough to the hut to climb the hill and rearrange his signal. Back inside, Gunnar examined the hut more carefully. Nothing appeared disturbed, but a new item sat on the table that definitely hadn't been there last night. A modern energy bar, Norwegian brand, with a manufacture date from 2 months ago. Someone had left it for him. A gesture of what? Goodwill? A warning that they could enter any time? The implications were unsettling. Whoever was watching him had supplies, mobility, and apparently the skill to move silently enough that Gunnar, a light sleeper after years of sailing, hadn't heard them approach. Gunnar spent the morning fortifying his position. He rigged a simple alarm system using fishing line from the hut's supplies and some empty cans, stringing it across the approaches to the door. He kept the iron poker from the wood stove close at hand, not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. And he moved the bonds from beneath the floorboard to a better hiding spot inside the woodpile outside, wrapped in waterproof material from his emergency kit. The radio, which he'd tried to repair using tools found in the hut, remained frustratingly dead. The water damage had been too severe. Without it, he had no way to call for help, no way to let anyone know where he was. Around midday, while melting snow for water, Gunnar heard a sound that made him freeze voices, distant but definitely human, speaking Norwegian. He moved to the window and saw 2 figures on the eastern shore, examining something on the rocks. One appeared to be taking photographs. His first instinct was to run out, shout for help, signal that he needed rescue. But something held him back. The figures moved with military precision, methodical and cautious. They weren't fishermen or casual boaters who'd happened upon the island. They were searching for something. Gunnar watched through the window as they worked their way closer to the hut. Both wore dark waterproof gear, carried backpacks, and moved like professionals. When they were perhaps 100 meters away, one of them pulled out what looked like a handheld device, possibly a GPS or some kind of detector. They knew about the hut. They were looking for it specifically. Gunnar stepped back from the window, his mind racing. If these were authorities, police or Coast Guard, they would have called out by now, would have announced themselves. Their stealth suggested something else. He grabbed his jacket and slipped out the back window, the only opening on the hut's western side, small but navigable. The cold hit him immediately, but he ignored it, moving quickly to put the rocky outcrop between himself and the searchers. From a concealed position 30 meters from the hut, Gunnar watched as the two men reached the door. They didn't knock. One checked the perimeter, while the other picked the lock with efficient movements. They entered, and Gunnar could see flashlight beams moving inside through the windows. They were searching, systematic and thorough, looking for the bonds, obviously. But how did they know? And who were they? The men emerged after perhaps 10 minutes, one of them speaking into a satellite phone in Norwegian. Gunnar caught fragments of the conversation. Nothing. Inside. No sign of bonds. Subject must have them. Continue surveillance. Subject. They meant him. The men headed north, back toward where the motorboat had been. Gunnar waited until they were out of sight, then circled back to the hut from the opposite direction. His alarm system had been bypassed with professional care, the fishing line cut cleanly, the cans removed and set aside. Inside, everything appeared normal at first glance, but Gunnar could see the subtle signs of their search. The floorboard he'd pried up was slightly more raised than before. Books had been moved fractionally on their shelves. Even his duffel bag showed signs of careful examination. But they'd found nothing, because the bonds weren't here. Gunnar retrieved them from the woodpile and sat at the table, trying to think clearly. Multiple people knew about this island, about PK's cache. The first watcher, who'd left the energy bar and changed his signal. Now these two searchers, professional and organized. How many others might be out there? He needed to understand PK's story better. There had to be something in the journal that explained why, 34 years later, people were still searching for these bonds. Gunnar spent the afternoon in intensive translation work, pushing through his limited Russian vocabulary with help from the dictionaries. A pattern emerged that he'd missed before. PK hadn't just been any operative, he'd been involved in financial operations, moving money for Soviet intelligence agencies. The bonds weren't operational funds in the ordinary sense. They were part of a much larger sum, perhaps hundreds of millions, that had disappeared during the Soviet Union's collapse. An entry from February 1991, they will look forever. 12 million is nothing compared to what vanished, but every thread leads somewhere. Must cover my tracks absolutely. The island solution is best remote, forgotten, marked on no current maps. After I move Anna and Mikhail, I'll return, retrieve the bonds, and we disappear completely. So PK had been part of a massive financial scandal or theft, and his 12 million was just a small piece. That explained the continued interest. If the bonds could be traced, they might lead to the larger missing fortune. Or perhaps others who knew about the Soviet-era financial operations simply wanted to claim whatever pieces remained. Either way, Gunnar was now sitting on evidence that dangerous people wanted very badly. As evening approached, he saw the motorboat return, pulling up to the northern beach. One figure this time moving with familiar purpose toward the hut. Gunnar positioned himself by the door, poker in hand, ready for confrontation. The man knocked 3 sharp raps. A courtesy, at least. "I know you're in there," the man called in Norwegian, his voice rough but not threatening. "We need to talk. I'm not here to hurt you." Gunnar said nothing, waiting. "My name is Christian. I knew Pyotr Konstantin. I helped him set up this safe house in 1989. I'm the one who left you the energy bar, who changed your signal to buy us time." "Time for what?" Gunnar called back. "To figure out if you're Russian intelligence, Norwegian police, or just the unluckiest sailor in the Arctic." Despite the tension, Gunnar almost laughed. "The third one. Then we have a problem. Because the men who were here today, they're FSB, Russian Federal Security Service, and they'll be back with more people, more equipment. They know someone found the cash, and they won't leave until they have it. Gunnar's grip tightened on the poker. Why should I believe you? Because if I wanted to take the bonds, I could have done it 3 nights ago while you were unconscious by the fire. I could have taken them and left you to freeze, and no one would ever know. Instead, I've been keeping watch, trying to protect you from exactly what's happening now. There was a long silence. Then Christian added, I owe Piotr that much. I couldn't save him or his family 34 years ago. Maybe I can save you, but you have to trust me, and we have to move fast. They'll be back tonight with thermal imaging equipment. They'll find you, and they'll do whatever it takes to get those bonds. Gunnar considered his options. Stay barricaded and wait for the FSB to overwhelm him. Try to escape alone, with no boat and no knowledge of these waters? Or take a chance on this stranger who claimed friendship with a dead Soviet agent? His father's compass, still in his pocket, pressed against his ribs. A reminder that sometimes you had to pick a direction and commit, even without perfect information. Gunnar opened the door. Christian Dahl stood in the doorway, and Gunnar's first thought was that this man looked like exactly what he claimed to be, a former intelligence operative. Mid-50s, weathered face, grey hair cropped military short, eyes that constantly scanned and assessed. He wore quality cold-weather gear and moved, with the careful economy of someone who'd spent a lifetime staying alert. "May I come in?" Christian asked, hands visible and empty. Gunnar stepped aside, still holding the poker. Slowly, Christian entered and closed the door behind him, his gaze sweeping the interior with obvious familiarity. "It hasn't changed much. Piotr would be pleased. He built this place to last." "You really knew him?" "For 3 years. We worked together, though on opposite sides officially." Christian moved to the table and sat without asking permission, the gesture somehow non-threatening. "I was KGB, stationed in northern Norway during the final years. Counterintelligence, mostly. Piotr was GRU, military intelligence. We had what you might call an understanding." Gunnar remained standing, skeptical. An understanding. "By 1988, we both knew the Soviet system was finished. The question wasn't if it would collapse, but when, and what would happen to people like us when it did. Piotr had a family he loved, more than ideology. I had debts to people who'd shown me kindness when I didn't deserve it. We helped each other prepare for the inevitable. By stealing $12 million? Christian's expression didn't change. Piotr redirected funds that were already stolen money, meant to bribe Norwegian officials to fund operations that were morally bankrupt. He converted it to bearer bonds and brought it here, to this island. I helped him establish this safe house, made sure it would be stocked and secure. The plan was simple. When the time came, he'd extract his family, bring them here temporarily, then move them to Canada, using connections I'd arranged. What went wrong? Everything. Christian's voice dropped. In March 1991, someone in Moscow noticed irregularities in the accounts. They started an investigation. Piotr knew he had to move immediately, but his family was in Murmansk and he was in Oslo. He had one chance, a single window when he could reach them and get them out. Gunnar sat down across from him, the poker now resting against the table. He didn't make it. He was shot at the Finnish border trying to cross. Died 2 days later in a hospital, never regaining consciousness. The KGB got there first, questioned him, but Piotr had already destroyed any evidence about where the bonds were hidden. He died protecting this place, protecting the possibility that his family might still escape. And his family? Christian's jaw tightened. Anna and Mikhail were killed in Murmansk 2 weeks later. Made to look like an accident, a gas leak in their apartment building. 3 other families died too, to make it convincing. But I knew. Everyone in the intelligence community knew. It was a message. The casual brutality of it hit Gunnar like a physical blow. A woman and child, murdered for someone else's theft. He thought of the photograph, that moment of happiness frozen in 1989, and felt sick. "I'm sorry," Gunnar said. Inadequate but genuine. "So am I. I've been sorry for 34 years. Christian reached into his jacket slowly, watching Gunnar's reaction. He pulled out a worn leather wallet and extracted something, a KGB identification card, clearly authentic, with his photograph and a different name, Kirill Sokolov. "This is who I was. Christian Dahl is who I became when I defected in 1992. I've spent 3 decades doing private security work, trying to make amends for things I did in service of a system that murdered children." He put the ID away. "When I heard rumors that FSB was searching for Cold War-era bearer bonds in Norway, I knew it had to be Pyotr's cash. I've been monitoring these islands for 2 months. "How did they find out?" Gunnar asked. "Someone in the old KGB archives probably found a reference. With modern technology, what took months to search in 1991 takes days now. They've been systematically checking locations associated with Pyotr's operations." Christian leaned forward. "The problem is, you found the bonds first, and now they know someone has them. They won't stop until they recover them or eliminate the witness." Gunnar absorbed this. "What do you want?" "To finish what Pyotr started. He wanted those bonds to protect his family. Since his family is gone, the next best thing is to make sure the money doesn't go back to the people who killed them." Christian's eyes were steady, honest. "I want to get you off this island safely, help you cash the bonds quietly, and split them. Half for you, half for me. We both disappear, the FSB gets nothing, and Pyotr's sacrifice means something." "That's convenient for you." "Yes, it is. I won't pretend otherwise. But it's also your best chance at survival and at making something good come from this tragedy. Otherwise, you die here, the FSB recovers the bonds, and everything Pyotr fought for was meaningless." Gunnar stood and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening landscape. His instinct was to refuse, to insist on doing things legally, properly. But what did properly mean in this context? The bonds had been stolen from a government that no longer existed by a man trying to save his family. The current Russian government had murdered that family. There was no moral high ground here, only shades of grey. And practically speaking, Christian was right. Gunnar had no boat, no radio, no way off this island, except through someone else's help. If he refused Christian's offer, he'd be at the mercy of the FSB when they returned. "How do I know you won't just take the bonds and leave me here?" Gunnar asked. "You don't. But consider I've had multiple opportunities to do exactly that. I haven't, because despite what you might think about former KGB officers, I do have a code. Pyotr trusted me with his life, and I failed him." "I won't fail you." Gunnar turned back. "The men who came today, you said they'll return tonight, with thermal imaging, probably armed with more than sidearms. They'll search systematically, find you, find the bonds. You have maybe 3 hours. Then we need to move now. Where are the bonds?" It was the moment of decision. Trust or don't trust. Gunnar studied Christian's face, looking for signs of deception, of hidden agenda. He saw only weariness, and what appeared to be genuine commitment. "Hidden," Gunnar said. "I'll get them, but we leave immediately, together. No separating until we're somewhere safe." "Agreed," Christian stood. "My boat has enough fuel to reach Hammerfest 3 hours in good conditions. We can lose ourselves there, find proper transportation to Oslo or wherever you want to go." Gunnar retrieved the bonds from the woodpile while Christian kept watch. They worked quickly, gathering only essential items. Gunnar took his emergency pack, the photograph of Piotr's family, and the journal. Everything else, a dead man's possessions and memories, would remain in the hut. As they prepared to leave, Gunnar paused at the door and looked back. This place had saved his life, had given him shelter when he had nothing. It had also given him a glimpse into another man's desperate struggle, a reminder that his own problems were manageable compared to some. "Thank you, Piotr," he said quietly to the empty room. Outside, the Arctic night was falling fast. They moved quickly toward the northern beach, Christian leading with confident steps. Behind them, from the southern end of the island, Gunnar thought he heard the distant sound of a boat engine. The FSB was returning, and they were out of time. They reached the motorboat in under 5 minutes, moving fast across the frozen landscape. Christian yanked the top off and started loading equipment while Gunnar untied the mooring lines. The engine to the south was growing louder, definitely approaching the island. "Get in," Christian ordered, turning the ignition. The engine caught immediately, a reliable purr that Gunnar found reassuring. They pushed off just as searchlights appeared around the islands. Southern Point. Christian didn't use running lights, navigating by moonlight and what appeared to be intimate knowledge of these waters. The boat cut through the dark sea, bouncing over waves, putting distance between them and the island. Behind them, the searchlights swept the hut, found it empty, then began scanning the surrounding waters. "They'll see us," Gunnar said, gripping the rail as spray hit his face. "Not if we're fast and lucky." Christian pushed the throttle forward, the engine roaring. They raced across the open water, every second stretching Gunnar's nerves tighter. A spotlight found them, held for a moment, then lost them as Christian cut sharply to starboard behind a small rocky outcrop. The maneuver was expert, using the terrain to break line of sight. They emerged on the far side, heading northwest now, and the searchlight was sweeping the wrong direction. After 20 minutes of tense silence, the lights behind them disappeared. Christian gradually reduced speed, the engine settling into a steady rhythm. They were alone on the dark Arctic water, heading toward the mainland. "That was too close," Gunnar said. "It's not over. They'll radio ahead, alert their people in Hammerfest. We can't dock there now." Christian pulled out a chart, studying it with a small flashlight. "There's a fishing village 40 kilometers west, smaller, less monitoring. We can beach there, find transportation overland." Gunnar nodded, still processing everything. The adrenaline was fading, leaving him exhausted and uncertain. He pulled out Piotr's journal, holding it carefully against the spray. "I tried translating this," Gunnar said, "but my Russian is limited. There are things I couldn't understand, dates, names, references I didn't recognize." Christian glanced over. "I haven't read it in 34 years. Piotr gave me a copy of the first few pages once, operational details, in case something happened to him. But the personal entries were his own. There's something about a larger amount. He mentions 12 million as part of something bigger." Christian was quiet for a long moment, steering through the dark water. Finally, he said, "Piotr was part of a special unit that managed financial operations, bribes, money laundering, funding for operatives." In 1990 and 1991, as the Soviet Union was collapsing, approximately $300 million disappeared from various accounts. Piotr's $12 million was a fraction of that. What happened to the rest? No one knows. Different operatives took different amounts. Some were caught, some disappeared, some were killed. The money scattered across a dozen countries, converted to various instruments. Some probably sits in forgotten bank accounts still. The $12 million Piotr took was unique because he converted it to bearer bonds, portable, anonymous, and still theoretically valid. Gunnar absorbed this. So the FSB isn't just looking for the bonds, they're looking for any thread that might lead to the larger missing fortune. Exactly. If they can trace Piotr's bonds, they might find connections to other operatives, other caches. It's not about 12 million to them, it's about potentially hundreds of millions. Christian's expression was grim. That's why they're willing to kill for it. They traveled in silence for another hour, the mainland growing gradually closer, a dark mass against the slightly less dark sky. Gunnar used the time to process everything, to consider his options. The bonds, wrapped in waterproof material and secure in his pack, represented both salvation and danger. With them, he could rebuild his life. Without them, he was just a shipwrecked sailor who'd stumbled into something far beyond him. "What do you actually want from this?" Gunnar asked suddenly. "The truth, not the story about making Piotr's sacrifice meaningful." Christian didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried genuine weariness. "I want to stop running. For 30 years I've been Christian Dahl, security consultant, former KGB agent, turned asset for Western intelligence. I've done favors for a dozen governments, made myself useful enough to stay alive and free. But I'm tired, Gunnar. I'm 56 years old, I have no family, no home, no rest. $5 million would let me disappear properly. Buy a quiet place somewhere warm, live out my remaining years in peace." "And what about me?" "The same if you're smart. Take your $5 million, pay your debts, set up your daughter's future, and then vanish. Change your name, move somewhere the FSB won't look. Start over. It's not ideal, but it's survival. I already tried starting over. That's how I ended up on that island." Christian smiled slightly. "Then maybe this time you start over with better financing." The village appeared ahead, a scattering of lights along a protected cove. Christian cut the engine early, letting momentum carry them toward shore. They beached on a rocky strip a kilometer from the Prus main settlement, pulling the boat up beyond the tide line. "We'll walk from here," Christian said. "Find a truck heading south, pay for a ride. By tomorrow evening, we can be in Oslo." They gathered their belongings and started walking. The cold was intense, cutting through Gunnar's layers. His injured shoulder throbbed with each step. But movement felt good after days of being trapped on the island, and the solid ground beneath his feet was reassuring. Halfway to the village, Christian stopped suddenly. "Someone's following us." Gunnar turned but saw only darkness. "Are you sure?" "Very." Christian's hand moved to his jacket. "Stay behind me." They waited, and gradually Gunnar heard it too, footsteps, careful but distinct. A figure emerged from the darkness, hands raised in a gesture of peace. A woman, perhaps 40, wearing hiking gear and carrying a backpack. "Don't shoot," she said in Norwegian, voice calm. "My name is Solveig Andersen. I'm a journalist with Aftenposten, and I've been investigating Cold War financial crimes for 3 years. I know who you are, Christian, and I know what you're carrying." Christian's gun was out now, not pointed at her but ready. "How did you find us?" I've been tracking FSB movements in Norway for months. When they started concentrating resources on the northern islands, I knew something significant was there. I saw your boat leave, followed at a distance. She lowered her hand slightly. I'm not your enemy. I want the story, not the money. The story will get us killed, Christian said. Only if you run. But what if you didn't? Solveig stepped closer, her expression intense. What if instead of cashing the bonds quietly, we expose everything? The original theft, the murders of Piotr's family, the FSB's current operations on Norwegian soil. Make it public. Make it loud. They can't kill you if the whole world is watching. Gunnar felt something shift in his understanding. That's insane. The FSB doesn't care about publicity. They care about international relations. Norway is a NATO member. If this becomes a diplomatic incident, Russian agents operating illegally, murdering civilians decades ago, Moscow would have to disavow them. You'd be protected by the exposure itself. Christian lowered the gun slightly. Or we'd be painting targets on ourselves. You already have targets on you. This way, at least you control the narrative. Solveig looked between them. I've documented everything. The FSB operations, the financial trail, connections to current Russian intelligence. All I need is the final piece, the bonds themselves, the journal, your testimony. With that, I can break a story that will echo across Europe. Gunnar looked at Christian. The older man's face was unreadable, calculating odds and angles that Gunnar couldn't see. There's another option, Christian finally said. He pulled out his phone, made a call, spoke briefly in Russian. When he hung up, his expression was different, harder, resolved. That was FSB. I told them where we are, and that I have the bonds. Gunnar's blood went cold. What? I'm sorry, Gunnar, but 5 million isn't enough anymore. The FSB is offering 20 million for the bonds and the journal. Cash, immediate transfer, no questions. Christian raised the gun, pointing it now directly at Gunnar's chest. I really did like Piotr, but he's been dead for 34 years, and I need to think about my own survival. Gunnar stared at the gun, pointed at his chest, his mind struggling to process the betrayal. Everything Christian had said, every gesture of trust and shared purpose had been manipulation, a con from the start. 20 million, Gunnar said quietly. That's what my life is worth to you. Don't be dramatic. I'm not going to kill you unless you force me to. Once they have the bonds and journal, they don't need you dead, just silent. Christian's voice was matter-of-fact, almost apologetic. You'll wake up in a hospital in a few days, with a story about being rescued after your boat wreck. Your memories will be fuzzy from hypothermia. You'll go home, rebuild your life with the insurance money from your boat. It's actually better for you this way. Solveig hadn't moved, watching the scene with calculating eyes. You're making a mistake, Christian. The FSB won't let either of us walk away. We're witnesses. You followed us. That's your problem, not mine. Christian gestured with the gun. Gunnar, take off the pack. Slowly. Gunnar's mind raced. The pack held everything, the bonds, the journal, Piotr's photograph. Without it, he had no leverage, no proof, nothing. But with Christian's gun trained on him, he had no choice. He started to shrug off the pack, moving slowly as instructed. Then Solveig moved. Fast, professional, closing the distance between herself and Christian in 2 quick steps. Her hand struck his wrist, knocking the gun off target. The weapon discharged, the shot incredibly loud in the Arctic night. The bullet disappearing into the darkness. Gunnar didn't hesitate. He rushed forward as Christian and Solveig struggled for the gun. Years of hauling nets and ropes had kept Gunnar strong despite his age, and he threw his full weight into Christian's side. The three of them went down in a tangle of limbs on the frozen ground. The gun skittered away across the rocks. Christian lunged for it, but Solveig caught his leg. Gunnar scrambled toward the weapon, his injured shoulder screaming in protest. His fingers closed around cold metal just as Christian broke free and charged toward him. Gunnar rolled, came up with the gun pointed at Christian. "Stop!" Christian froze, breathing hard, calculating. For a long moment nobody moved. Then, slowly, carefully, he raised his hands. "Smart," he said, "but shooting me doesn't solve your problem. The FSB knows approximately where we are. They'll be here soon, 15, maybe 20 minutes, and you still need a way off this coast." Solveig stood, brushing dirt and ice from her clothes. "I have a car, 2 kilometers up the road. We can reach it before the FSB arrives if we move now." "Why should I trust you?" Gunnar asked. The gun still trained on Christian. "Because unlike him, I told you exactly what I wanted from the start." The story. Nothing more. She pulled out her phone, showed him the screen, a recording app that had been running. "I've documented everything, including his betrayal. That's leverage. The FSB can't simply disappear people when there's evidence, recordings, a paper trail." Christian laughed bitterly. "You're naive if you think recordings stop them. They'll confiscate your phone, destroy the evidence, and call it a routine investigation. Not if I've already uploaded it to secure servers with dead man switches. If I don't check in every 6 hours, everything goes public automatically." Solveig's expression was fierce, determined. "I've been preparing for this story for 3 years. You think I didn't plan for exactly this scenario?" Gunnar made a decision. He kept the gun on Christian but spoke to Solveig. "Your car, how far exactly?" 20 minutes walking, maybe 15 if we run." "Then we run. But he comes with us." Gunnar gestured at Christian with the gun. "If the FSB is coming, I want a bargaining chip." They moved quickly through the darkness. Christian in front where Gunnar could watch him, Solveig leading the way with a flashlight. The cold was brutal, stealing breath and numbing exposed skin. Gunnar's legs burned with effort, his body pushed beyond reasonable limits after days of survival and stress. Behind them, growing closer, came the sound of vehicles, multiple engines, heavy and fast. The FSB response team was coming down the coastal road. "Faster," Solveig urged, breaking into a run. They scrambled up a rocky slope, Christian stumbling once and nearly falling before Gunnar grabbed his jacket and hauled him forward. Whatever else the man was, he was still their only connection to the Plaza. Full story, the only person who could corroborate Piotr's history and the murders that followed. Solveig's car appeared ahead, a sturdy Volvo SUV, slightly battered but reliable looking. She had the keys out before they reached it, doors unlocking with a chirp that seemed incredibly loud in the night. "In, quickly," she commanded. They piled in, Christian in back, with Gunnar beside him, gun still in hand. Solveig started the engine and pulled onto the rough coastal road without turning on the headlights, navigating by moonlight and memory. Behind them, perhaps a kilometer back, headlights appeared multiple vehicles, moving fast. "They've seen us," Christian said, his voice carrying satisfaction even in defeat. "You can't outrun them, not in this." "Watch me," Solveig said. She accelerated, the Volvo's engine roaring. The road was narrow, winding along the coast, dangerous even in daylight. At night, at this speed, it was nearly suicidal. But Solveig drove with skill, taking corners. but with precision, using every meter of available road. Gunnar braced himself against the door, the bonds and journal in his pack pressed against his side. Everything Pyotr had fought for, everything that had cost him and his family their lives, reduced to a high-speed chase through Arctic darkness. "Where are we going?" Gunnar shouted over the engine noise. "Inland. There's a mountain pass 20 kilometers ahead. Beyond that, we can lose them in the valleys, make for larger towns where they can't operate as freely." Solveig glanced in the rearview mirror. The pursuing headlights were closer now, gaining on the straightaways. A bullet struck the rear window, spider-webbing the glass but not penetrating. Then another. "They're shooting at us?" Gunnar couldn't believe it. "On Norwegian soil? They're desperate," Christian said, "and they have orders. Bearer bonds aren't just money, they're evidence. Evidence of corruption, of murders, of operations that continue to this day. Moscow can't let that become public." Solveig took a sharp turn, and the pursuing vehicles momentarily disappeared from view. She accelerated up a steep grade, the Volvo's all-wheel drive gripping the icy road. At the crest, the landscape opened up a broad valley stretching ahead, with a narrow road cutting through it. "The pass," Solveig said, relief in her voice. "Once we're through, they'll have to be more cautious. Too many villages, too many witnesses." But as they crested the hill, headlights appeared ahead. Coming from the opposite direction, the FSB had anticipated their route, positioned a blocking force. They were trapped. Solveig slammed the brakes, the Volvo sliding on the icy road. She spun the wheel, trying to turn around, but it was too late. The vehicles behind had caught up, blocking their retreat. The ones ahead were closing fast. In seconds, they were surrounded by 4 black SUVs, their occupants emerging with military precision. Armed men, at least 8 of them, weapons, drawn and trained on the Volvo. A voice called out in Norwegian through a loudspeaker, "Exit the vehicle, hands visible. You will not be harmed if you comply." Gunnar looked at Solveig, then at Christian, then at the gun in his own hand. Every option led to the same place: capture, interrogation, probably death, once they'd surrendered the bonds and journal. "What now?" he asked quietly. Solveig's hands were tight on the steering wheel, her face pale but determined. "Now we see if my insurance policy is worth anything." She reached for her phone, but before she could dial, one of the FSB agents fired. The shot hit the front tire, deflating it instantly. A clear message: no escape, no negotiation. They were out of options, out of time, and surrounded by people who would do whatever it took to retrieve what they'd come for. The standoff lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like an eternity. Armed men surrounded the Volvo, weapons steady, waiting for orders. Gunnar could see their faces in the SUV headlights, professional, emotionless, trained. Then one man stepped forward, older than the others, wearing a long coat against the cold. He approached the driver's side window, tapping on it with one knuckle. Solveig lowered it slowly. "Miss Anderson," the man said in accented Norwegian, "we've been monitoring your investigation with interest. Very thorough work. Unfortunately, it ends here." "I don't think so." Solveig's voice was steady despite the circumstances. "Everything I have is already uploaded. Cloud storage, multiple servers, automated distribution to media outlets if I don't check in. You kill me, the story breaks within hours." The man smiled without warmth. "We've already accessed your accounts. Your dead man switches were disabled 8 minutes ago. Our cyber team is quite efficient." He gestured to his men. "Please exit the vehicle." Solveig's face went pale. Her bluff had been called, her insurance policy invalidated. Gunnar saw her hands. tremble slightly on the wheel before she steadied them. "I'm not getting out," she said. "Then we extract you. The outcome is the same, only more painful for everyone involved." The man's tone never changed, clinical and precise. "Mr. Veland, Mr. Sokolov, you as well. We have much to discuss." Christian leaned forward. "Commander Volkov, I believe we can reach an arrangement. The bonds and journal for safe passage. Everyone walks away." So Christian knew him. That confirmed what Gunnar had suspected. This betrayal had been planned, coordinated. Christian had probably contacted them days ago, when he first confirmed Gunnar had found the cash. Volkov shook his head. "The arrangement has changed. We no longer require your assistance, Mr. Sokolov. You've become a liability." The words hung in the cold air. Christian's expression shifted from confidence to uncertainty to fear in the space of a breath. He'd been played just as he'd played Gunnar. "You can't," Christian started, but Volkov was already turning away. "You have 10 seconds to exit the vehicle before we use force. 10, 9, 8. Gunnar's mind raced through scenarios, each one ending badly. They were outnumbered, outgunned, with no escape route. The gun in his hand felt useless against 8 professional operatives. Even if he fired, wounded 1 or 2, the rest would return overwhelming fire. 7, 6, 5. Solveig reached for the door handle. "I'm sorry," she said to Gunnar. "I really thought I had enough protection." 4, 3. Then, from the darkness beyond the headlights, a new voice called out in Norwegian. "FSB operatives, this is the Norwegian Police Security Service. You are conducting illegal operations on Norwegian soil. Lower your weapons immediately." Everyone froze. New lights appeared, flooding the scene. Police vehicles, at least 6 of them, approaching from multiple directions. Officers emerged, weapons drawn, surrounding the FSB team. Volkov's expression remained impassive, but Gunnar saw calculation in his eyes. A firefight here, with Norwegian police, would create an international incident that even Russia's government couldn't easily smooth over. "Commander Volkov," the Norwegian voice continued, a woman, stepping into the light with the confidence of authority. "I'm Inspector Haugen with PST. You and your team will lower your weapons and submit to detention while we sort out this situation." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Volkov made a gesture, and his men slowly lowered their weapons. Not dropping them, Gunnar noticed, just lowering, ready to raise them again if the situation shifted. Inspector Haugen approached the Volvo, her attention on Gunnar. "Mr. Veland, please exit the vehicle. You're not under arrest, but we need to secure the scene and determine what's happening here." Gunnar climbed out slowly, the pack with the bonds still on his back, the gun now tucked into his jacket. Solveig and Christian followed. The Norwegian officers moved efficiently, separating them from the FSB operatives, creating space and reducing tension. Haugen studied Gunnar with sharp eyes. "Your friend Bjorn Halvorsen filed a missing persons report 5 days ago. We've been searching for you. When we intercepted communications suggesting FSB interest in the Northern Islands, we connected the pieces." She gestured to Solveig. "And Miss Anderson's research provided context we didn't have." "You were working together?" Gunnar asked Solveig. "Not exactly, but I've been feeding information to PST for months. When they realized you'd stumbled into something significant, they started coordinating with me." Solveig looked relieved but exhausted. "My dead man switches were disabled, but not by the FSB. By Norwegian intelligence, to prevent the story from breaking prematurely and compromising their operation." Christian stood apart, guarded by 2 officers. his face unreadable. The man who'd been a Soviet agent, then a turncoat, then a would-be profiteer, now just looked old and tired. Volkov stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture of diplomatic courtesy. "Inspector Haugen, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. We're conducting a recovery operation for property belonging to the Russian Federation, cultural artifacts essentially, nothing that concerns Norwegian security. Bearer bonds worth millions, connected to Cold War espionage and multiple murders, don't qualify as cultural artifacts, Commander." Haugen's voice was steel wrapped in politeness. "You're operating illegally on our soil with armed personnel. That's an act we take very seriously. The bonds were stolen from my government by a man you murdered, along with his family. We have documentation, testimony, evidence." Haugen nodded toward Gunnar, including a journal that details the entire operation. Gunnar pulled the pack off his shoulder, feeling the weight of it. Inside were answers to questions that had haunted intelligence services for decades, evidence of crimes, of corruption, of a system that had destroyed lives without hesitation. He thought of Pyotr, dying at a border crossing, thinking about his wife and son. He thought of Anna and Mikhail, killed in an apartment fire that wasn't an accident. He thought of his own daughter Astrid, safe in London, free to live her life without fear. "What happens now?" Gunnar asked. Haugen considered him carefully. "That depends on several factors. The bonds are technically evidence in a criminal investigation, multiple investigations actually. Russian, Norwegian, possibly international. Their legal status is complicated. They may be tied up in courts for years. And if I just wanted to go home, to forget all of this, you can't. You're a witness now, Mr. Veland. Your testimony about finding the cash, about the FSB's actions tonight, it's crucial." She paused. "But Norway protects its witnesses. You'll be safe, compensated for your cooperation. And when this is finished, you can resume your life." Volkov spoke again, his voice carrying an edge now. "This is a diplomatic matter. Russia will file protests through proper channels. Those bonds are our property." "Stolen property," Solveig interjected, her journalist's instinct overwhelming caution. "Acquired through criminal operations, hidden to evade justice. Russia has no legitimate claim." "And what would you do with them, Miss Anderson? Write a sensational story? Become famous?" Volkov's smile was cold. "You're as motivated by greed as anyone here, just greed for attention rather than money." Before Solveig could respond, Christian spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of his years. "The bonds should go to Pyotr's family. If any relatives survive, cousins, distant relations, they deserve them. It's what Pyotr wanted." Everyone turned to look at him. Gunnar saw something in the old spy's face, genuine remorse, perhaps even redemption. "After 34 years of living with my failure, and to save them, that's the only thing that makes sense," Christian continued. "I betrayed Gunnar tonight because I'm weak, because I'm tired of running. But Pyotr was strong. He deserves better than having his sacrifice turned into a bureaucratic fight or a journalist's scoop." Haugen nodded slowly. "That's actually not a bad idea. We'll investigate whether any relatives exist. If they do, and if the legal issues can be resolved, that might be the fairest outcome." Gunnar felt something release in his chest. The bonds had never really been his, despite the temptation to claim them. They belonged to a dead man's dreams, to a family destroyed by violence. If some part of that family survived, they should benefit. He handed the pack to Inspector Haugen. "It's all there. The bonds, the journal, a photograph, everything Pyotr left behind." She took it carefully, respectfully. "Thank you, Mr. Veland." The Norwegian police secured the scene with practiced efficiency, separating the FSB operatives and documenting everything. Gunnar sat in the back of a warm police vehicle, wrapped in a thermal blanket, watching the organized chaos unfold outside. His body ached, exhaustion settling into his bones now that the immediate danger had passed. Inspector Haugen returned after 20 minutes, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Gunnar and sat beside him. The FSB team will be escorted to the Russian embassy in Oslo. Diplomatic immunity protects them from prosecution, but they'll be declared persona non grata and expelled from Norway. Commander Volkov is already on the phone with Moscow, no doubt spinning the narrative. She sipped her coffee. But we have everything documented. The illegal operation, the weapons, the attempted seizure. It'll be a black eye for Russian intelligence. What about Christian? Gunnar asked. Complicated. He's a former KGB officer who defected decades ago, but his attempted betrayal tonight creates issues. He'll be detained while we sort through his status and determine what charges, if any, apply. Haugen studied Gunnar. He seems genuinely remorseful now. Whether that's tactical or authentic, I can't say. Gunnar thought about the man who'd helped Pyotr, then failed him, then tried to profit from that failure. I think he's just tired. Tired of being whoever people need him to be. Aren't we all? Haugen pulled out a tablet, showed Gunnar a photograph. We've been researching Pyotr Konstantin's family. His wife Anna had a sister who emigrated to Estonia in 1987. She's still alive, 73 years old, living in Tallinn. She has 2 adult children and 5 grandchildren. Gunnar stared at the photograph, an elderly woman with kind eyes, surrounded by family at what looked like a birthday celebration. Anna's sister, Pyotr's family, survived and thriving despite everything. They never knew what happened to Anna and Mikhail, Haugen continued. The Soviet government claimed it was an accident, and by the time the sister could have investigated, the USSR had collapsed and records were chaos. She's lived her whole life not knowing the truth. Will you tell her? We'll have to. She's entitled to know what happened to her sister, and potentially entitled to the bonds if the courts rule in her favor. Haugen closed the tablet. It won't bring her sister back, but maybe it provides some closure and financial security for her family. Gunnar nodded, feeling the rightness of it. Pyotr had wanted his family protected. This wasn't the family he'd known, but it was family nonetheless. Blood connected across decades and borders, surviving when Pyotr himself couldn't. What about Solveig's story? Gunnar asked. Will this become public? Eventually, though not in the sensational way she might have wanted. The diplomatic aspects need to be managed carefully. But yes, the truth about Pyotr Konstantin, about the murders, about the Cold War operations, it'll come out. Slowly, through proper PR channels, but it'll come out. Solveig was visible through the window, arguing with another officer, gesturing emphatically. Even now, she was fighting for her story, for the truth to be told on her terms. Gunnar respected that, even if her methods had nearly gotten them killed. She saved my life, Gunnar said. When Christian pulled the gun, she didn't have to do that. I'll make note of it. Might help her case when we're deciding how much information to release and when. Haugen finished her coffee. Now, about you. We'll need formal statements, depositions, probably testimony if this goes to international courts. But for tonight, we're taking you to Tromsø. Your friend Bjorn has been pestering us hourly for updates. I think he'll be relieved to see you alive. The thought of Bjorn's solid, dependable Bjorn brought unexpected emotion welling up in Gunnar's chest. His friend who'd tried to stop him from leaving, who'd filed the missing persons report, who'd probably been sick, with worry for days. And my daughter, Astrid? We contacted her through the British Embassy. She's already booked a flight to Tromsø. Should arrive tomorrow afternoon. Haugen smiled slightly. She was quite insistent about seeing you immediately. Diplomatic protocols be damned. Gunnar closed his eyes, overwhelmed. Astrid was coming. His daughter, who he'd feared had written him off completely, was flying across Europe to see him. The promise he'd made to visit her in London, it seemed she was beating him to the reunion. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything, for finding us when you did. Thank you for cooperating. Not everyone would hand over $10 million so readily." Haugen stood. The bonds might have been tempting. They were, Gunnar admitted, very tempting. But they weren't mine. They never were. He thought of Piotr's photograph, that moment of happiness frozen in time. Some things matter more than money. Outside, the FSB vehicles were being escorted away by Norwegian police. Volkov sat in the back of one, his face visible through the window, expressionless, already planning his next move. Men like him never stopped, never truly accepted defeat. But for tonight at least, he'd lost. Christian was placed in a separate vehicle, handcuffed, but treated with professional courtesy. As they loaded him in, he caught Gunnar's eye through the window. For a moment, something passed between them, not quite forgiveness, but perhaps understanding. Two men who'd made mistakes, who'd been offered chances at redemption, who'd chosen differently in the crucial moment. Gunnar raised one hand in acknowledgement. Christian nodded back, then disappeared into the vehicle. The drive to Tromsø took 3 hours through the Arctic night. Gunnar dozed fitfully, his mind replaying the past week, the storm, the hut, the discovery, the betrayal, the rescue. It felt impossible that so much had happened in just 7 days. He'd left Tromsø as a broken man, running from his failures. He was returning as something different, though he wasn't quite sure what yet. They arrived at dawn, the sky brightening to grey as they pulled up to a small hotel near the harbour. Inspector Haugen had arranged a room, security, everything he'd need while they processed his statements. But before going inside, Gunnar asked the driver to stop at the harbour itself. He walked to the edge of the dock, where the Nordsjøerne Times had departed a lifetime ago. The water was calm, reflecting the morning light. Somewhere out there, his boat lay broken on an island's rocky shore. But he'd survived. Against impossible odds, he'd survived. He pulled out his father's compass, the glass still cracked from the wreck. The needle spun briefly before settling on north. Still working, still true, still pointing the way home. "I found my way back, Dad," Gunnar whispered to the memory of his father. "Took the long route, but I made it." Behind him, a familiar voice called out, "Gunnar!" He turned to see Bjorn running down the dock, moving faster than a man of 62 should, his face a mixture of relief and anger and joy. They met halfway, and Bjorn pulled him into a crushing embrace. "You stupid, stubborn fool," Bjorn said, his voice breaking. "I thought you were dead. I know. I'm sorry." Gunnar held his friend tightly. "I should have listened to you. Should have called. Should have done everything differently." "Yes, you should have." Bjorn pulled back, gripping Gunnar's shoulders, looking him over for injuries. "But you're here. You're alive. That's what matters." "I'm here," Gunnar agreed. "And I'm not going anywhere. Not for a while." They walked back toward the hotel together, two old friends reunited, while the Arctic sun continued its slow rise over the harbor. Behind them, the sea stretched endlessly, beautiful, dangerous, and finally at peace. 6 months had passed since the night on the coastal road, and Gunnar stood once again at the Tromsø harbor, but everything felt different now. The water sparkled in the late spring sunshine, and the air carried the warmth of returning life. Seabirds circled overhead, their calls mixing with the sounds of boats and distant conversation. Astrid stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm. She'd stayed in Tromsø for 2 weeks after the rescue, and in those weeks they'd talked more honestly than they had in years. About the divorce, about his failures, about her own struggles with watching her parents' marriage crumble. The conversations had been difficult, sometimes painful, but necessary. They'd begun to heal what had been broken between them. "You're sure about this?" Astrid asked, gesturing toward the modest building behind them. Gunnar nodded. The sign above the door read Constantine Maritime Heritage Center in both Norwegian and Russian. It wasn't large, just a renovated warehouse space near the harbor, but it was his. A place to preserve maritime history, teach traditional boat-building skills to young people, and honor those who'd been lost to the sea's dangers and human cruelty. The center's founding had been funded by a portion of the bond's value. After months of legal wrangling across 3 countries, a settlement had been reached. Anna's sister in Estonia received the majority enough to secure her family's future for generations. But she'd insisted that a portion go to Gunnar, recognizing that he'd protected her brother-in-law's legacy when he could have simply taken everything. The amount had been enough to pay his debts, set aside money for Astrid's future, and start something meaningful. Not the charter business he'd lost. He had no desire to recreate that. This was something new, something that mattered beyond profit. "The first class starts next week," Gunnar said. 8 students, all teenagers from the area. We'll teach them traditional boat building, navigation, respect for these waters. Skills their generation is losing. "Dad would have loved this," Astrid said softly, meaning Gunnar's father. "Passing on what he taught you." Gunnar touched the compass in his pocket, his father's compass, now repaired, the cracked glass replaced. He carried it everywhere, a reminder of navigation both literal and metaphorical. Finding your way home wasn't always about geography. Sometimes it was about finding purpose, connection, a reason to keep moving forward. Bjorn emerged from the center's door, carrying coffee in paper cups. He'd become Gunnar's partner in the enterprise, teaching the practical skills while Gunnar handled the administrative work and historical research. It suited them both, giving structure to their days and meaning to their accumulated knowledge. "Inspector Haugen called," Bjorn said, handing over the coffee. "The trial date is set for September. Solveig's testimony will be crucial." The journalist had gotten her story after all, though in a more controlled way than she'd initially wanted. Her articles about Cold War espionage, about Piotr and Anna's tragedy, about the bond's recovery, had won international attention and several journalism awards. She'd visited Gunnar twice, conducting extensive interviews, always respectful of his desire for privacy, while pursuing the truth relentlessly. Christian's fate had been more ambiguous. After months of negotiation, he'd been released with the understanding that he'd cooperate fully with ongoing investigations into Cold War-era intelligence operations. He'd sent Gunnar a letter from somewhere in South America, brief, apologetic, thanking him for not pressing charges when he could have. The letter had included contact information for Anna's sister, suggesting Gunnar might want to meet her someday. "Are you going to the trial?" Astrid asked. "I have to. My testimony is part of the evidence." Gunnar sipped his coffee, watching a fishing boat glide into the harbor. But after that, I'm done with it. Let the lawyers and diplomats argue about the remaining legal questions. I've said everything I need to say. His phone buzzed a text message from an unknown number. Gunnar opened it and found a photograph. An elderly woman surrounded by family, holding a framed picture of Piotr, Anna, and young Mikhail. The message, in slightly awkward English, read, "Thank you for protecting my sister's memory. Your kindness honors them. May you find the peace they could not." Katerina Gunnar showed the photo to Astrid. She studied it silently, then squeezed his arm. "You did the right thing. Dad, with everything, the bonds, the testimony, all of it. I hope so." He pocketed the phone. "I keep thinking about Piotr, about the choices he made. He risked everything for love, for family. I spent so many years focused on business, on success, that I forgot what actually mattered." "You're remembering now," Astrid said. "That's what counts." They walked together along the harbor, past boats being prepared for summer fishing season, past tourists taking photographs, past the everyday bustle of a northern town awakening from winter. Ingrid had visited last month, civil, even warm, pleased to see Gunnar finding his footing again. The divorce was final, but the bitterness had faded. They could be friends now, or something close to it. At the end of the dock, Gunnar stopped and pulled out the compass. The needle pointed steadily north, reliable as always. But he realized he didn't need it anymore. Not really. He knew where he was, where he'd been, and most importantly, where he was going. "Your grandfather told me this compass would always point me home," Gunnar said to Astrid. "I spent most of my life thinking home was a place, a house, a boat, a business. But it's not. It's people, connections, the things we do that matter beyond ourselves." Astrid leaned her head against his shoulder. "When are you coming to visit me in London?" "Next month, if that works for you. I've never been properly. Always meant to. Time I actually followed through on a promise. I'd like that." They stood together, watching the water, father and daughter, reunited through crisis, and choosing to stay connected through intention. The Arctic sun was warm on their faces, and for the first time in years, Gunnar felt genuinely content, not happy in the wild, unrealistic way of youth, but content in the deeper way of someone who'd survived darkness and found light on the other side. His phone buzzed again, a reminder about the first class of students arriving tomorrow for orientation. Young people who'd learned traditional skills, who'd hear stories about respect for the sea and the people who'd navigated it before them. Maybe he'd tell them about Piotr someday, about a man who'd tried to protect his family and failed, but whose sacrifice had ultimately meant something decades later. Some lessons were worth passing on. Gunnar pocketed the compass and turned back toward the harbor. Astrid, at his side, Bjorn waiting at the center's entrance. The future stretched ahead, uncertain in its details, but clear in its direction. He'd found his course again, not by running away as he had before, but by staying, by building, by choosing to matter. Sometimes you have to be lost before you can truly find your way home. Gunnar had been more lost than he'd ever imagined possible, shipwrecked, betrayed, caught in the currents of history and greed. But he'd found his way back, not to where he'd started, but to somewhere better. And that, he thought as he walked toward the building bearing Piotr's name, was enough, more than enough. It was everything that mattered.